I thought the term guest proclaimer was interesting. I hope that by the end of this, it doesn't feel like we've walked 500 miles and then another 500 miles. Um, and then the second song that we did today, the Great is the Lord, that actually Great Are You, Lord. The reason I love that song so much is because when I was a kid, my dad was a music pastor. Well, he still is a music pastor. Hopefully he retires soon. He's getting old. Um, he might be watching this. That's why I said that. Um, but I would, as a music pastor's kid, I would spend a lot of time just thumbing through the hymnal, just kind of looking at songs and looking for names that I might recognize. And I remember number 12 in the 1992 version of the Southern Baptist hymnal was "Great is the Lord" by Michael W. Smith. And I knew who that name was. I didn't know who Fannie J. Crosby was yet. And so whenever my dad was thinking about the sort of songs and things that he puts out for church service, I'd be like, "Dad, you need to do number 12." And then there'd be that one Sunday a year where he'd do it, and I'd be like, "This is the greatest thing ever." and and so when All Sons and Daughters came out with that song, I was like, now I have like a current updated version of that song, so that we can sing it. And my dad always said that a song, he didn't feel it. He's always kind of been a blended person. He likes traditional, he likes the new stuff, and that's a song that he feels like he can play, and it feels, I don't know, it just feels right. But usually though, his rule is that unless Phillips, Craig, and Dean have sung it, probably can't do it at church yet. So that's a long way to say I really like that song. So for those of you that, you can go ahead and pop up my second slide up there. This is just a fancy Google slide presentation that all teachers use. I'm Seth Tripp, for those of you that don't know me. My family have been coming here for about a year now. We moved here from St. Louis, Missouri. We were there for about 6 years, 5 or 6 years. And before that, we were in Indianapolis. My wife is Indianapolis born and raised. I just was there through high school and college. Like I said earlier, my dad is a music pastor. So we moved around a lot as a kid. Born in St. Louis, but lived in Huntsville, Alabama for almost 8 years. Lived in Honolulu for 3 years. And then moved to moved to Indianapolis when I was in middle school. And so I've been in quite a few places. Very early in my life, actually, I wanted to eventually live in Virginia. When I was a kid, I'm currently a history teacher at the Blue Ridge School, and I started learning about history when I was obviously very young, and really got into Thomas Jefferson, and I wanted to go to his university when I was like a little kid. And then it's pretty cool that God has created a path for me to be here just down the road, and we never thought that we would get to be here. My wife Rachel me and her have been married for 12 years, going on 13. We have 3 kiddos you'll see running around. Hayden is 11, Braden is 9, and Jackson is 4, and he is the problem. But one of the reasons why we started coming here and really started to get connected here is that day one, and she's not in here to hear me say this, but day one, when we moved here or started coming to church here, we felt immediately that Brittany Mullenix loved our children, just immediately. I don't know if they tricked her or something, but no, we felt immediate love in that way. And then as we started to get plugged in, we started feeling the same way. Rachel is she runs the hospitality stuff. That's really like her spiritual gift. She loves doing that. And she was able to, I think it was maybe like within the first month we were here, they were like, somebody needs to do this because the person that's doing it is moving away. And Rachel's just like, I guess I'll do it. And so she stepped in and did that. And then probably not long after that, made the mistake of standing behind Tom in worship service. And then he's like, you should sing with us. And I was like, okay. And so I started doing that. And so those are some of the ways that we're plugged in. I'm also a member of the In the Real World class, which as those members know, it's just like the real world in that we don't get a whole lot of things done. We do a lot of cards. That's a big thing that we do. Not playing cards. Yeah, no. Okay, you do playing. If you get there early, there's blackjack. That's so, yeah. A little bit more about my background. Like I said, my dad's a music pastor. So kind of like what Tom does, but with not black clothing and shorter hair and more dad jokes. And my mom does something with computers. I've never been completely sure of what it is. But what I do know is that my mom has been probably one of the hardest working people that I know. When we were kids, my mom would often work really late, but then she would also spend time going to college. And then there was just one thing that I remember as a child is my mom going to college, having a full-time job, and being pregnant with my youngest brother. And I just know, I just always looked up to her and her work ethic. And I know one day, I hope to be like her, unless, not the pregnancy thing, barring a junior-esque Arnold Schwarzenegger sort of situation, I hopefully am not there. That is a joke firmly for millennials and their Gen X siblings. There'll be a few of those through here. All right. My life was pretty typical of a 90s pastor's child. We were the first people there, always, and the last ones to leave. We know what the church looks like when the lights go out, and it's honestly a kind of a scary place. But the good part about that is we got to spend all that time in church, and we were around people and so many people that loved on us throughout our youth. And I felt really connected to the church for a very long time, throughout youth group and all those things. And then I went to college, and college wasn't the reason why things sort of changed. It just kind of naturally progressed in that way, and that seemed to be the thing that hit I don't know about a snag is the right term, but I just started feeling like there's more to this than what's going on. And so I spent a lot of time contemplating things, and then I eventually got to a point where I was actually kind of angry with things. And my wife can tell you I was angry for quite a few years, and about kind of the way that things were going. And I still felt like God was important. I feel like my faith was important. I felt like, God is my Savior, and that's the path I want to go down. But whatever is happening right now is not the way that things should go. I felt like the faith that I grew up with had turned into this religious experience that was more about creating power in earthly things than about really creating God's kingdom on earth. And so in that journey, I started spending a lot of time in the Old Testament prophets and in poetry, and really got connected to Lamentations when I was in my youth. And it's kind of been the thing that I've gone back to in times that are tough. I attempted to teach Lamentations to that in the real world class. We made it through a couple chapters before snowpocalypse and did all of that. But we're kind of going to kind of wanted to wrap that idea up today with you. You can go to the next. You can go to the next slide. I should come up with like a buzzword to say every time. Change the slide, like I don't know, banana or something. Just a brief kind of introduction to Lamentations. Lamentations is, and Zach sort of referenced this last week, is following it's actually a reflection, not like a real-time like analysis. It's a reflection on this time of exile that that the Israelites felt after they're captured by the Babylonians and taken to Babylon. And it is a series of poems that is meant to express a few things. One, it's meant to really express this frustration with God about what's going on. It's also meant to lament the things that have happened because of them, and then eventually it's a way to reconcile back with God in that journey. And I feel like it's a life metaphor for what really happens in life often. Is that a lot of times we find ourselves in a bad place, and then we get mad that we're in this bad place, and then we blame God for it, and then we figure out, no, actually we might have done something we might have had a part in this. It might have been an issue on our behalf. And then we start seeking a way to find ourselves back to what God really is and what God really means. And so I want to kind of go through that with you. And real briefly, I'm not going to read through the whole book and each of the chapters, but I want you to have an idea of what each of them kind of go about talking about. Chapter 1 is this beautiful metaphor of Israel as this widow that has been abandoned and is experiencing this monumental amount of suffering. And then chapter 2 is a continuation of that, but it also expresses this part of admission around this breaking of the covenant that Israel is a part of. Chapter 3, the metaphor switches from the widow to a lonely man. And he talks about that transition from acceptance of these things that are happening and then falling back onto God and understanding that God keeps his promises. And then chapter 4 is this comparison between pre-exile and exile life. And then chapter 5 is really this expression of corporate grief and kind of wraps everything up. And so with Lamentations, there are a few points, 3 points that I want to make. Banana. So this book is supposed to represent isn't just a physical journey. I think what you see a lot of here is physical representations of grief and also a change in status for the Israelite people, but it's really this idea of wandering into what a new life could be when one day we do reconnect with that God that we are in love with. Go ahead to the next one. I don't want to say banana again. I'll explain Scott's Stapp here in a second. Or I don't know, maybe it would be less of a distraction to do it now. But in the big thing, the first point that I want to make is that we are held to a high standard. There you go, higher. He might take us higher. I've tried to find a GIF of the Cowboys Thanksgiving performance and the guy who's flying. I thought that was a sacrilegious bridge too far. So I decided not to do that. But the big thing here is that in Lamentations, the author is talking about this covenant that God has created with his people. You see it all throughout the Old Testament and then eventually the New Testament when God talks about several times how he makes promises with the Israelite people. You know, he does it with Abraham. He does it with Moses. He does it with David. And the key thing in all three of those is at the beginning is that if you follow my commands and be my people, that's the start of it. That's the start of each of those. If you do these things, if you follow my commands and be my people, I will give you X, Y, Z. I promise that this blessing will happen to you. And in Lamentations, what we know, the reason why they're in exile is because these covenants have been broken. We know the story that Israel in several occasions has gone about this new way of doing things that isn't the way that God told them that they should be doing things. And then when they don't uphold those, they are at the beginning shocked that somebody would hold them accountable for violating this covenant. And so, God says, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to give you this air. I'm going to do this thing for you. But you just have to do this one thing. And this is going to make earthly living awesome. But the Israelites have a problem keeping it. When I was thinking about this, I kept on thinking about, I've never read the books, but my wife has probably read the Harry Potter books at least, 30 times? And all of its sub-extras, and I kept thinking about the unbreakable vow and what happens when you break the unbreakable vow at the end of the last book, and which is death, and then being surprised that it might end. Go ahead and go to the next one for me. And so the second thing that I want to make a point about is that what they incur is God's justice. I think we hear God's wrath. I heard about God's wrath a lot growing up. Like, these things are going to happen to you if you don't follow, the way that God wants you to do things. Amos, who is, actually you talked about Amos last week, who is one of these prophets who, before the exile comes, says, you need to change your ways, and because if not, this is what's going to happen. And then when they don't listen to him, he says, let justice roll on like a river, righteousness like a never-failing stream. So God's ultimate proclamation there is that we should be performing righteousness. And I want to kind of make a segue into a little bit about what God's anger is. I think as humans, we struggle with this idea of God's anger. God's anger is not something that is vengeful. We get angry at each other and we want to enact something out on another person. We want them to experience the same amount of pain that we have experienced. But God's not like that. Every bit of God's justice is about taking his people and bringing him back to him. I think about a song that kind of came out around the time I was in youth group, Draw Me Close to You, Never Let Me Go. God's whole point here is, I want you to draw close to me. These things are happening because you have walked away from me and you have said, I'm going to do things my own way. And God says, no, turn around. I was at a basketball game yesterday, and this guy was guarding another guy, and he said, turn him. You need to turn him so he'll go the other way so that you'll have an opportunity. And I just think about, God's just shouting, turn. You need to turn. Because when you turn, I'm going to be right there, and I'm going to pull you close to me. And so that's what God's justice is about. God's justice isn't about being vengeful or angry with us. God's justice is about us slowing down and turning around and saying, you know what, I'm going to pause and I'm going to draw in close to you. And so when I think about that, I think we have to do what it says in that we do righteousness. And so what does that mean to do righteousness? Doing is an action. And so some of those things that we can do in order to do righteousness is create ethical relationships between people, between one another, a balanced relationship. I teach sociology sometimes, and there's this concept in sociology about relationships, and that if there's a power dynamic in that relationship and one person stops getting something beneficial out of the relationship, then that relationship ends. And part of creating ethical relationships is having a balanced relationship with the people around you. Understanding that when somebody gives something to you in a relationship, they're giving a part of themselves to you, and that you need to reciprocate and do the same. And then holding other people responsible for those ethical relationships. Going beyond charity and work to prevent justice. This is something that that has honestly been a point of contention in my life. Is that a lot of times I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and so there's a lot of different offerings that we offer. One of them being like the Lottie Moon offering, and then other sorts of offerings that happen throughout the year. And so a version of perhaps getting involved in world's injustices is we'll give money and we'll say, well, we're giving to this offering, and so we're working towards injustice. But I think God calls us to do more than just put money in an offering plate. I think he asks us to go out and actively get involved in the work to prevent injustice. So sort of like what we're doing with Rise Against Hunger. Actively getting involved in opportunities to prevent injustice. And then the last one is to deliver those who've been oppressed from their oppressor and defend the weak. Often, though, what happens here, and we got to be careful about this one, is as a history teacher, I often talk about people who have been oppressed and then how they were unoppressed or rescued. But many times what happens is that those who have been oppressed or felt oppression upon them often then reciprocate that oppression on those who oppress them. And I think sometimes when we live in a secular culture, we can feel as Christians like we're being oppressed. Like maybe our way of life isn't matching up with the world. And so we feel like maybe we need to lash out in some sort of Christian-motivated oppression. But actually, we're called to do the exact opposite, which is anytime we see oppression, we need to work against that oppression, even if it's against people who we may disagree with. And I think the big reason for that is because each individual person is part of the Imago Dei. It's my only, I don't know, is it Greek? Is it Latin? I don't know. One of those in this sermon. Everybody's made in the image of God, and so then deserves to be treated that way. And so when we're freeing people from oppression, we need to make sure that we are not accidentally or maybe sometimes purposefully creating systems that then reverse the oppression and continue that oppression. Zach referenced something last week about how the Israelites came out of Israel after being forced to being slaves for generations, and then Solomon turning around and building all these great temples with slave labor. Now, we have that tendency to then look at systems and be like, it's okay if we do it, it's not okay if other people do it. And we need to be examining ourselves as we do that. I think you can go to the next one. So in Jeremiah, I believe this really sums up that calling. And Jeremiah is another one of those prophets that is speaking to power. And he said, this is what the Lord says, do what is right, do what is just and right, rescue from the hand of the oppressor the one who has been robbed. Do not wrong or violence to foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Do not shed innocent blood in this place. For if you are careful to carry out these commands, the kings who sit on David's throne will come through the gates of this place, riding in chariots and on horses, accompanied by their officials and their people. But if you do not obey these commands, declares the Lord, I swear by myself that this place will become ruin. So not only are we commanded to rescue the oppressor and help the weak and powerless, but if we don't, there's a higher standard set upon us, and there are things that will happen because of that. You can go to the next one. So again, often those that experience oppression will become oppressors if they don't understand what God's justice is about, which is ultimately about not just Christians, but pointing the whole world back to God. When I was a kid, in college, I went to this conference. They still do it. It makes me feel old to think about how many years they've been doing it. But the Passion Conference, led by Louis Giglio and Passion City Church in Atlanta, and Chris Tomlin, and all these artists would be there. And I remember Louis Giglio giving a talk about the real witness isn't walking up to somebody's door and knocking on it and say, hey, have you heard of Jesus? It's living your life in such a way that people will know that you are of Jesus, and this is what it means to be like Jesus. This is what it means. It doesn't mean, knocking on your door to death. I did that when I was a kid. When I was 13 to 17, I did that every Tuesday for 4 years. And what I noticed is that we got way more worried about, we would always do a report at the end of the night. So we would have at 6 o'clock, we would have a class. And I don't think there's anything wrong with this class or evangelizing or things like that. That's not what I'm saying. But we would have a class that would teach us how to go out and talk to people. And then we would go out and we would knock on doors. Sometimes they were random people. Sometimes they were people that had come to church, and we were just like reconnecting with them. And then we would come back and we would do a debrief about what we just did. And the majority of the debrief was this. It was a collection of numbers. How many salvations did you come back with? How many doors did you knock on? It was way more about volume than it was about deep connection. And so, and me and Tom had a conversation about this a couple of weeks ago, is that sometimes when you knock on somebody's door and tell them about Jesus and they say the prayer and you go back and you connect with that person weeks later, they'll be like, I don't even remember that happening. And so when we seek to understand God's justice on those who don't currently reside in a church system, we need to be focusing more on creating relationships and connecting people to the relationship of God than necessarily collecting individuals to bring into a church building. Go on to the next one for me. And the last one, the most hopeful one, is God keeps his promises. So early on I talked about this idea of covenant and how God has multiple times throughout history connected with his people and said, I want to make a promise with you. Here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want to give you at the end. The last one that he gives before Lamentations is the Davidic covenant, which is if you follow my commands and you be my people, and your sons will do those things as well, I promise that one day from the line of David will come the Messiah. In chapter 3 of Lamentations is that switch from the woman to the lonely man. And at the beginning of that, God the author says, I am the man who has seen affliction by the rod of the Lord's wrath. He has driven me away and made me walk in the darkness rather than light. So not great things happening there, not feeling great about ourselves. We're in darkness, we're walking in darkness. One of the early monikers that people in the church get in the 2nd and 3rd and 4th century is this name of sojourners or wanderers. It's often what they're called. And when you look at the name sojourner, it means one who takes up residence in a land that is often not their own for a temporary amount of time, or simply somebody who's not going to stay here for very long. And so one thing that I think brings a lot of comfort is that if we take on that moniker of sojourner always, not just when we're in a time of desperation, we'll know that times of darkness don't last very long because we're in the journey through the darkness. And that one day it will end. And God's promises will be fulfilled. We're not meant to walk in that darkness forever. In chapter 4, I can't remember if that's on the next slide or not, to be honest. Can I take a peek at that slide? Nope, not yet. I'm actually not there yet, sorry. At the middle of chapter 3, the author understands this. He understands that his journey in through the darkness isn't going to last forever because God keeps his promises. Go to the next one for me. Lamentations 3:22 through 31. We know, you probably have heard some of this before. But it's a reflection on who God is and his love and his justice and what that means. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. You've probably heard that song before. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him. The Lord is good to those who wait for him, to the soul who seeks him. It is good that one should wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord. It is good for a man that he bears the yoke in his youth. Let him sit alone in silence when it is laid on him. Let him put his mouth in the dust. There may yet be hope. Let him give his cheek to the one who strikes, and let him be filled with insults. For the Lord will not cast off forever. For though he cause grief, he will have compassion according to the abundance of his steadfast love. On verse 29, I'm reminded, I read a book. Maybe by this sermon you understand how entrenched I was in 2000s Christian culture. But I read a book, a biography of Jeremy Camp, who's a Christian artist. And he talked about this relationship that he had with another Christian artist from a band that called The Cry. And the lead singer of this band would come up to him at every concert or event that they shared together, and he would say, "How's your FaceTime?" That's how he would start every conversation with him. How's your FaceTime? How are you spending? Are you getting on your face before God? I'll admit I have trouble with that. I have ADHD, so the idea of sitting in silence for more than 30 seconds just like blows my mind. The guy that leads our program towards character development and spiritual education at school, he actually goes to church here, and he's currently doing the thing that I'm going to talk about. He often spends chapel talks with his eyes closed in reflection the whole time, and sometimes those chapel talks can go on for 10 minutes, and I just don't understand how I would fall asleep. But it's a practice that maybe we all should take in, is that taking a moment to just place yourself in this feeling of God's presence. Because in God's presence, even in moments that are very difficult, there is peace and there is hope. Go to the next one for me. So how does God do this? So in chapter 4, there's despair because, and I hope I'm not going too long here. I'm worried about that. In chapter 4, the author talks about how the heir to the throne of David is taken into exile and lost. And there's probably this point thinking that, well, how is God going to fulfill the promise that he gave us, that we're going to have this Messiah? And what we don't know is that God is a big fan of the slow reveal. And we know that in Luke, we know that when Jesus is in Mary's womb and the angel comes and he says, this is the one who is promised. It's pretty awesome when you think about it. Is that, and I had the slide on the front before this, but in Lord of the Rings, which is, we all know the parallels between Lord of the Rings and Scripture and how Tolkien does that. But there's this moment where Aragorn, who's that prince who was promised, goes into the mountains after reforging the sword that was broken. And these men who thought that their oaths could never be upheld and that nobody could ever give them rest. And they're so sure of themselves that they've created a relationship full of animosity towards the human race. And when Aragorn comes and they try to take him out, and Aragorn has the sword and he fights back and he says, what? They're like, that line was broken. And he was like, no, it's been remade. It's the same sort of thing. Oh, this is probably cooler than Lord of the Rings, I think. And so Jesus comes and he is that fulfillment, and he says, and then we ask, what is the way to show God's justice? And Jesus is like, I'm the way. This is how you show God's justice. And so if we want to understand God's justice, then we need to look at Jesus' life. And I promise I'm not going to go the second 500 miles with you for that. We can go to the next slide. But some ways that we can do that real quickly. Some ways that we can do that: go and seek righteousness for others, people who have found themselves out of relationship with God. Go find them and help them find righteousness again. Love your neighbor as yourself. Instead of working towards self-preservation, maybe take on some self-sacrifice. And then seek to bring God's vision of human flourishing on earth in ways you have control of. And that's the second part of that is most important. And Rachel can tell you that I've had some nights where I go down a rabbit hole of something on the internet, and then I just find myself completely consumed with the wrongs that are in the world. Because I'm somebody that feels things very strongly, and the whole idea of injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere. And I think sometimes my best friend always talks about the idea of working within your square inch. And if we all work within our square inch, then we all have the ability to create a world of lots of square inches that are filled with human flourishing. That is God's vision for what human flourishing looks like. Because God has a vision for humans flourishing on earth. If he didn't want them to flourish on earth, he wouldn't have put them on earth. If he wanted to keep them here, him forever, he could have, but he didn't. So he wants us to flourish here. And then another way to put it is Micah puts it very simply. do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. I think that summarizes it pretty well. You can go to the next slide for me. And then lastly, well, not lastly, I have one, sorry. I keep on saying that, and then that doesn't happen. At the end of the book, at the end of Lamentations, because I don't want to leave you hanging, at the end of the book, the author ends it on a kind of a cliffhanger, or at least some people perceive it as a cliffhanger. And he says, he talks about, please bring us back, please connect us back to God, renew us to yourself. And then the last verse is, unless you have utterly rejected us and are angry with us beyond measure. And I think what maybe gets lost sometimes in that verse is that he's admitting some things, is that saying we don't deserve this, we're not eligible for this, we're put in a place where we don't, we deserve to walk in darkness forever. But then what he really is saying at the end is he's like, your will be done, whatever it is. You're God. If you're utterly disappointed with us and you reject us, then that's it. But we know that he's not like that. But just like that moment of clarity to say, whatever you want to do it because you are who you are. Let me surrender to your justice so that I can do righteousness whenever I can. Next one for me. So, an idea to maybe think about this week is this idea of asking God for accountability. I think often we ask God for blessings, but we don't ask God to hold us accountable. God, these are your commands. Hold me accountable for your commands. Understanding that God's commands don't lead us to wrath, but lead us to stronger connection with him. Like the prodigal son, turning around and drawing close to me could never make me mad at you. It only could bring me closer to you. And I want to wrap up with a song that means a lot. I'm not going to sing it. I'm just going to tell you the lyrics. You can go to the last one for me. My favorite band to this day, and I really got connected to them when I was a teenager in youth group. Feels old to know that I went to their 20th year anniversary album release concert, and that was like 3 or 4 years ago. That makes me feel old. But they have this song that if you go to one of their concerts, you'll hear this song, and they'll bring out this flag, and they'll wave it, and it's usually the last song that they do at the end of the night. It's the song "Where I Belong," and it's really a song about lament, about being lost and being in a world where it doesn't really connect that I should be here, and my soul feels just like this isn't right. And it talks about the main chorus of the verse goes like this, and it's like, until I die, I'll sing these songs on the shores of Babylon. Very apropos. Still looking for a home in a world where I belong, where the weak are finally strong, where the righteous right the wrongs, still looking for a home where I belong, is the chorus. And then the last closing part of the song says, I still believe we can live together. You and I, we're here together now. I still believe in us together. And you and I, we begin forever, eternity now.